Welcome to Republican Roundtable. I am your host, Max Reimer. Again, we find ourselves with national news and national politics. We've had a lot of talk about guns. Guns are back in the national news cycle. We have kids from high school after this most recent Florida school shooting who seem to be on every news station available. So we wanted to bring back friend of the show of the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus, Rob Doar, to talk a little bit more about guns.
Yes.
Rob, thanks for joining me again.
Under
these circumstances.
Right. I hate that I have to be here, but I'm glad I'm here.
Right. Well, welcome to the show. Like I mentioned in the opener, we have guns back in the news. Last time we talked a little bit about the Las Vegas shooting. Still some kind of open-ended questions on that whole fiasco. Now we have the school shooting in Florida. 17 kids died. Kid was carrying an assault rifle,
as they call it.
Yep. Your office at the Gun Owners Caucus, how have you guys been dealing with some of the fallout from that event?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we do is we assess the situation and look and take a hard look and see where were the failures. Was there a law that may have prevented these things? Who dropped the ball if a ball was dropped? What would have made a difference? And that's kind of the approach we took. We look at all that. The media reaction is always immediate, it's swift, and it's typically wrong.
It's been hysterical. It's been unending.
Well, and even in the moments after these events, there seems to be a desire to be more quick than right. And so there's a lot of misinformation that gets out. And then even in the aftermath, we see that there's kind of a sustained effort and a lot of times calls for legislation or things like that wouldn't have had any impact on the incident.
Mm-hmm. From your standpoint, and you and Brian, your counterpart at the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus, I've followed you closely on Twitter and seeing some of the really intense responses to you both.
Yeah.
What if any legislative solutions are out there to curb something like this that you would recommend? Because immediately the first place that people go, the media goes, liberal politicians go, and in some cases Republicans go, is to start outlawing the weapon of choice, the actual tool that was used in the killing. What is your response when people come at you with that type of rhetoric, with that type of intense emotion?
Yeah, it's a little bit interesting because in situations like this, there's this one's a little bit different in the fact that there's a very coordinated and very sustained response. And I think that has greatly to do with the different players in the world of the gun control movement right now. You have the emergence of Michael Bloomberg's Everytown, which are a marketing machine. The Moms Demand Action, who merged with the Mayors Against Illegal Guns to make Everytown, they were headed up by Shannon Watts, who was a PR executive for Monsanto, among other huge companies.
Okay.
When it comes to messaging, she knows what she's doing. So I think we are seeing a very sustained media plan that's been executed. To get more to your point is, a lot of the things that are being called for would not have made a single bit of difference in this incident. So you look at things like they're asking for background checks. This shooter, like the vast majority of all mass shooters, had successfully passed a background check. Mm-hmm. You're seeing things for mental health awareness. This individual clearly had some mental health issues, but there was nothing that was diagnosed, nothing that would have sent a message. We also saw a great failure of law enforcement and school officials in dealing with somebody who was clearly dangerous. And so you look at all that, and then we look from the sphere of public policy. What can we do to shape that and improve that? And the first question I always ask is, well, if our current laws were followed, would that have helped? And in this situation, especially for somebody who poses an imminent fear to themselves or to somebody else, there are mechanisms in place to secure that individual and make sure that they're not going to harm somebody. I don't see anything that would have. I haven't seen any proposals that would have helped that. So then we go to look at, if we're talking about school security, if we want to keep our kids safe, what can we do in that sphere? And in that sphere, I think there's a wide array of things that we can do, both in procedural things and just policy-driven items, as well as physical security of our schools. And that's some things that we've been working on with legislators from both sides of the aisle to actually, and I appreciated when Governor Dayton held his press conference too. He separated his gun control agenda from his school safety agenda. He was very clear that he still wants gun control items passed, but he didn't want them to be a hindrance to bipartisan school safety items. So if we're talking about keeping our kids safe, focusing on those school safety items is, I think, going to show much more efficacy than trying to control one of the many options that somebody has to inflict mass harm.
Do we arm teachers at that point?
Well, it's kind of a little known fact in Minnesota that it is currently allowed for teachers and school staff and even members of the general public to be armed with the permission of a principal or a superintendent. I think that that program has worked okay. I think that we do know that there are quite a few school districts that have armed personnel on site. What I think is really important to recognize is the one thing the thing that makes the most difference in an active shooting situation, the thing that stops it the fastest, is effective counterforce. The faster that effective counterforce arrives, the lower the body count is. And I think yesterday's shooting in Maryland was a perfect example of that. You had an incident where an armed school resource officer, within a minute, ended a threat, and there was only one fatality, and that was the shooter. I think that is something that every school district needs to take a look at. Now, I certainly am not a favor of requiring anybody to be armed. That's one of the dumbest things that you could do, is put a gun in the hands of somebody who doesn't want a gun in their hands. But I think school districts, if they have staff that are willing to go through the training, exercising that mechanism, not only does it provide an effective counter response, it also removes that gun-free zone stigma that the location has. And that's what's really attractive to a mass shooter. They want unlimited time to have complete control of the situation. So having a gun-free zone is actually an attractant to these people, because they want to inflict mass harm. And when they have a low-risk environment to do so, being a gun-free zone, that serves as an attractant. Now, if you say, imagine if we had these signs outside of our schools: our staff are armed and will defend our students, with lethal force if necessary. That's a very unattractive target to somebody. They're going to try to find a target that is going to be more conducive to their fantasies. Right.
I remember instinctively thinking to myself, I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Okay.
Right. Just and when you think of Baton Rouge, I'm not talking about Metro Baton Rouge. I'm talking about Baton Rouge.
The Bayou.
And Rob, I asked myself. I was driving past a few of the houses, and they were what you would expect. And thinking to myself, would I rob this house? Instinctively. Versus if I were driving through, say, like Metro, Edina, or something like that. And I think you're right that a mentality is created when you know, or when you think you know, that somebody has possible defense against your offense. And I'm a normal guy. I'm not a guy with a mental, condition. This shooting, specifically in Florida, has prompted a certain response within our own legislature. And that's where you're at every day. You're down at the Capitol every day, fighting against some of these bills and fighting for some of these bills. We had a pretty radical bill come through the pipeline from Representative Linda Slocum. Can you describe that bill a little bit, what it did, and what kind of the fallout was and the implications of that bill was?
Yeah, so Linda Slocum's bill, I call it the mother of all gun control bills. It might be easier for me to...
Is that the title of the bill?
Yeah. It might be easier for me to name the things not in it than what is in it. But the bill itself, numerous egregious things. It expanded the definition of what an assault weapon is to include any semi-automatic firearm that accepts a magazine.
Okay.
So that's the vast majority of them. It also made it so that you couldn't transfer those out of the state. You couldn't sell them. You couldn't gift them to your or to anybody, and you couldn't leave them to your heirs upon your death. Upon your death, that firearm had to be surrendered to law enforcement and destroyed. I think the idea there is that she's trying to, within a generation or two, make semi-automatics extinct in the state. There are also things like magazine bans. You had to register all of your firearms. You had to go to your police chief to get a license to own a firearm. Your police chief could decide the criteria that would be needed in order for you to own those firearms. And I think we all know some particular police chiefs who would set as onerous criteria as they could in order to do that. But here's the one that...
You don't need to name names.
Yeah,
on that one,
I could.
By the way.
And some of them are within this area that would be viewing
No
this
comment.
practice. Yeah.
No comment on any of that.
But the really amazing things, the things that I think are exceptionally, all of it is incredibly infringing on the Second Amendment. But one was that you had to require police officers to allow police officers into your home to inspect your firearm storage. So at any moment,
is that real? Is that what?
I guarantee you that that's in the bill. I'll point it out to you. But at any moment you get, and then Mr. Reimer, we need to come inspect your firearm storage. We see you're a license holder. We've got these guns registered to you. Where are they? And then you've got to go and let them in and show them, and they have to be stored to their standards. And then all of that data that they're collecting, all that registration data, all that gun, and maybe even the police reports of where your guns are stored. They want to make that public data so that anybody could have access to it. So you talk about strolling down a dine and wondering, would I rob that place? Now you've got a list of all the homes of gun owners, what guns they own, and probably even where they're physically stored. So and that's not even the whole thing of the bill, but I could probably spend the rest of the show talking about that. So.
No, I do find it fascinating because when I ran for office in all of our League of Women Voters forums and that kind of thing, Linda was in the same room, near the same podium and that kind of thing. A bill like this, a lot of people called it political grandstanding.
Yeah.
I want to push back on that in the case of Linda. Linda, with a bill like this, from what you've described and from how I have heard her talk, she's not politically grandstanding. She really hates guns.
Yes. Yeah,
that's what it comes down to.
Well, and she's seen the visceral reaction to this bill. She's since reintroduced another version of it, which removed like 2 of the provisions, but it's the same version again. That was just released this week. So she's committed to this type of legislation. That much is clear. It's not just politically grandstanding. I think what was also fascinating is she solicited about a dozen co-sponsors on this bill, and then they started dropping off.
Right.
After we started really pushing against this. Very, very committed anti-gun people who would love to see it. People like Representative Erin May Quaid, who signed on to the bill, then blamed a clerical error. But she did sign on to the bill. I put a video up of her signature on the bill. And she is one of the most anti-gun representatives in the state. And she even jumped off of the bill. If your bill is too extreme for people like Representative Erin May Quaid, then you really are out of touch with where Minnesota is.
You make mention of groups like Everytown and Moms Demand Action and that kind of thing. Is there something more nefarious behind bills like this, or do you think stuff like this just came from Linda Slocum's brain? Who's driving an initiative that extreme?
Yeah.
Because what you described, Rob, is quite frankly Hitlerian. When we're talking about registering door to door, checking in, seeing where your guns are at,
Show
and then
us your
publicly
papers,
posting
yeah.
it. If the implications to that are beyond anything that I think we could imagine living in America.
Right.
Where is this coming from?
So I think there's legislation like that, which I think is coming from people who are just committed to getting rid of guns. I think Linda Slocum is a representative along that kind of cloth. If every gun could be melted down and turned into windmills and solar panel frames, she would be happy to have that done.
Okay.
And I think that tips the deck. I think that is why when we look at bills that are quote unquote common sense, we see a slippery slope. And I am not one who typically likes to subscribe to slippery slope arguments. But Linda Slocum's bill, House File 3022, tips the deck to what they actually want. So we have things that come through like the gun violence restraining orders, which sound really, really common sense. You say if somebody is accused of domestic violence, we want to make sure that they're not able to exercise that. But one of the provisions within the gun violence restraining orders requires or allows for law enforcement, for a family member, a loved one, a member of a medical professional to make an accusation against you.
Yep.
And then without your participation in the court proceedings, come and take your firearms away.
Right.
And then you have to come and prove that you're innocent.
Right.
So they call this common sense when that is clearly an assault on due process. I mean, anybody who's been in any, I had a rather rough upbringing. I've seen where the courts are used to penalize somebody because of nonviolent domestic disputes.
Certainly.
Anybody who finds themselves to that now has to enter into legal proceedings in order to exercise their rights. So things like that, they call common sense. Those are the things that every town is pushing. The Michael Bloombergs, they want to come up because they wanted to try to sway the majority of the public to say, they'll go to the high level and say, well, we want to get guns out of the hands of domestic abusers.
Right.
And to the public, that sounds
great.
it's like a no-brainer.
Yep.
But then you dig into the bills and you see these really, really infringing unconstitutional things. The gun violence restraining orders, an ex parte hearing, which is the one where you're not at, where a judge decides whether or not you can own property, particularly property that's guaranteed by a constitutional right. There's Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, and Sixth Amendment violations to that. So that's when you see Michael Bloomberg, they're going to be coming out with the things that sound reasonable. And then you really have to dig into it. And that's where I think we provide a valuable service in making sure that gun owners understand that it's not reasonable and why the bills are objectionable.
A lot of the co-sponsors of this bill in question, in fact, all of them were members of the DFL,
Right.
correct?
Yep.
What is it like for you and Brian, Gun Owners Caucus, at the Capitol, realizing that, yes, you are fighting against mainly the DFL, but also a disturbing trend has now kind of perked up, with the situation with Scott Jensen, where now you're almost combating against the rhetoric of reasonable Republicans. What is that like for you? Has it ever been like this before?
Yeah, it hasn't. Usually, we've always been able to rely on the Republicans to be the standard bearers when it comes to gun rights, and to be fair, a fair amount of Democrats. We've got a lot of Democrats, particularly the ones in Greater Minnesota, who are very committed to the causes of Second Amendment. I'm a Republican, but luckily within my capacity and my role as the political director for the Gun Owners Caucus, I only need to stay in one lane.
Yep.
And so I can accept all our allies in that one lane. But we've even had people like Representative Dario Anselmo from Medina, who is signing on to gun control bills. So it is a little bit interesting, and I think it's unfortunate because it puts other suburban Republicans in a bit of a bind as well, because Republicans like Representative Randy Jessup or Sarah Anderson, or there's a few others that are kind of in that suburban ring. Keith Franke, for example, they are now going to be asked, well, if Scott Jensen can sign on to universal registration and universal background checks, why can't you? Why is that unreasonable? So it puts a little bit of extra pressure on them, and then I have to kind of be the bad guy to go and tell them, no, you're going to have to tell your constituents and educate your constituents why you can't vote for this. Mm-hmm. And that's a hard thing to ask for a representative who's hearing calls for reasonable, common sense measures. It's hard to tell them that they're going to have to spend some time and money and political capital educating their constituents.
Right. Yeah, that is a tough spot. We talked last time you were on, Rob, a little bit about background checks and the implication of background checks. Universal background checks, and we talked about the phraseology of polling and some of the psychology behind how questions are asked. What is in place right now for a background check?
Yeah.
What does that look like if I want to go and just, let's say I want to go and buy an AR-15?
Sure.
What does that look like for me? Where is my name run currently? What is the process? Because I want our viewers to understand that when we talk about more stringent universal background checks, what that actually means as a barrier to the rights that we already have.
Sure.
What's in place right now?
So right now, let's say you go to Cabela's, you want to pick out an AR-15.
I have to be 21 at this point.
You have to,
At Dick's, not
at
Cabela's.
Dick's. And there is a little bit, there's some stores that won't sell it anyway, and there's some actually, I'm getting a little off track, police chiefs that won't issue the permit. So in order to go and get a AR-15 from Cabela's, for example, first you have to go to your local police chief, or your local sheriff if you don't have a local police chief, and get a permit to carry or a permit to purchase. Usually,
just to own.
Just to go and purchase it.
Okay.
Yeah, you need to get a permit because our law says that if you want a handgun or a scary black rifle, you have to get this additional permit. Now, to get the permit to purchase, they run a background check on you, and then you get this little card that says, I've had a background check. So now you go to Cabela's, you pick out your firearm, and then they are going to say, okay, let me see your permit to carry, your permit to purchase. You show it to them. They go and run the same background check again at the point of sale to sell you the firearm. That goes with a call over to the ATF, the FBI, you fill out the paperwork, the background check form, they run it. Most of the time, you get a good to go or a not good to go. Now, if your name is rather unique, then you're probably going to be fine. What a lot of people find is actually if their names are similar, then they have a lot of issues. And unfortunately, this can catch up a lot of people persons of color, because if your name is like Muhammad, for example, if you have a Muhammad in your name, almost always you're going to get delayed or denied on your background check because your name is going to be same name or similar to somebody who's prohibited. Same thing for like a Gonzalez. It happens to a lot of people. Our chief counsel at the Gun Owners Caucus, our general counsel, Ben Russ, does a lot of work with firearms denials. And he has said that the majority of his clients are named Mohammed or have some sort of a name that's tied to a culture. And that's unfortunate. Anyway, so getting off track a little bit there. No, it's good. But so you go through that, you get your background check, and then you can go and get your walk out of the store with your firearm. So that's the most common way. There are also ways that we can do a private transaction. So let's say I've got an extra,
which is what a lot of people seem to have an issue with, right?
Right. So they have an issue with this private transaction where I've got a spare AR-15. The market's hot right now, and I want to sell it. And so I say, "Hey, Max, you want an AR-15?"
I do.
Yes, we agree upon a price. If I know you personally, I'm probably not going to worry. I know you're not a prohibited person. It is illegal for me by law to sell to somebody who I know is a prohibited person. It's a felony. So I cannot sell to you if I know that you are prohibited by law from owning a firearm. But let's say I'm going to sell it on the internet. If I sell it on the internet, that doesn't mean that I get to just mail it to your house. If I sell it to somebody, I either have to meet them face-to-face to do the transfer or mail it to a federally licensed dealer who is going to have them come and do a background check.
Okay.
Now, if you look on like Arms List, which is a popular site that people engage in private firearm transfers, the vast majority of the listings there, you'll see P2P or P2C needed. P2P or P2C required. What that means is the seller, they are going to want to see a permit to carry or a permit to purchase from you in order to process that transaction, just to know that you've gone through a background check. So they call this the gun show loophole. That whenever you hear the gun show loophole, this type of transaction is what they're talking about.
Okay.
Because when you go to a gun show, almost every table there is a licensed dealer.
Yes.
And they have to run background checks. So it's a bit of a misnomer there. So when they craft this legislation, though, what they want to do is they want to say, okay, Rob and Max, you guys can't do that private transfer. You need to go to a federally licensed dealer in order to do that. What they don't exclude is it is a transfer, not a sale. So let's say I'm not selling you an AR-15. Let's say you're going coyote hunting and you want to borrow it for a weekend.
Okay.
I can't do that under these bills that have been introduced.
Wow.
We have to go to a federally licensed dealer, and I have to pay $50, $100, $150, whatever they want to charge to transfer
to hand
that
me
to
the
you.
gun.
To hand you the gun. But guess what? When you're done with the gun, what do we have to do?
We have to transfer it
it back and pay another $100 or $50, $100, $150 to transfer it back. So maybe you and me, we're a little bit more privileged. We can absorb those kinds of infringements. But let's talk about a single mom in Minneapolis whose friend wants to loan her a firearm. Neither one of them have a vehicle, but maybe she's in an area of high gang activity, and she just wants the ability to defend herself and her kids. Second Amendment right to do so. They don't have transportation. How many gun shops do you think are in the city of Minneapolis?
I can't imagine
0.
any, right?
They have zoned out
Zoning?
every gun shop in existence out of the city of Minneapolis. So this person without a car now, in order to just get a gun, maybe a gun that costs $100 or $200 just for self-defense, they have to find transportation out of the city in order to pay $50, $100, $150 just to accept that loan. So when we're crafting legislation, we need to think about all of these infringements, all of these extra rungs in the ladder that we're adding for law-abiding citizens. And then we need to look at who are we actually trying to catch? We're trying to catch criminals. Do you think criminals are engaging in this type of transaction? No, they're not. If we add all of these extra steps, are they going to all of a sudden start engaging in those steps? No, they're not. So we're adding all of these extra infringements on law-abiding citizens that, in order to hope that we're going to catch criminals who have made a career out of disobeying the very laws that we're trying to enforce.
Right. So that sounds like just incredibly extensive for the most part, background checks that we have in place already. Rob, with our last 2 minutes, what are your initiatives at the Gun Owners Caucus this session? We talked a little bit about that last time. And where do we go from here in Minnesota?
So what we're really focused on is making sure that we are holding the line and not accepting any sort of infringements on the Second Amendment. We're not obstructionist. We're just being practical with our recognition of the Second Amendment rights of Minnesotans. We are also very active, involved in several school safety measures. And I don't have enough time to look into those, but if you go to gunowners.mn, we're happy to talk to you about some of the measures that we're standing behind to help keep our kids safe. And these are measures that are going to keep them safe from any kind of intruder in a school, whether they have a gun, a knife, whether they're mentally ill, just to keep those people safe. And then we're primarily focused on just making sure that gun owners are aware and mobilized, and they're ready to defend their Second Amendment rights, but also defend these members of the House and of the Senate, our representatives and our senators, in their elections, to make sure that when they're taking these bills that are the tough bills to take, that they're going to be there to help make sure that they stay in office for doing the right thing. Because Michael Bloomberg will spend millions of dollars trying to kick these legislators out, and we need to be on the defense about that.
Rob Doar, one more time, what is the website people can go to learn more about you?
Yep, it's gunowners.mn. And we also have a rally coming up on April 28th at the Capitol. It'll be from 12 to 2. Our friends from the NRA, from the Minnesota Republican Party, the National Republican Party, and other allies in the state will be there. It's going to be a huge rally, and we could really use a lot of people to turn out there.
Very good. Show up. Rob, thanks again so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Max.
Until next
Appreciate
time.
it.
Thank you again for joining us. Until next time, this has been the Republican Roundtable. I'm Max Reimer.